So we're going to move on to the emotional response, and this is prejudice. So as we grow up and we see things, the way that we learn is by grouping things together in clusters and categories and schemas or in stereotypes, right? Because whenever we also lump together social categories, then those are the stereotypes. So that's the cognitive process, just learning. Now, in the same realm, those schemas or stereotypes are going to be associated with certain attitudes and feelings. And once the attitudes and feelings, whether they're positive or negative towards a social group, then that is really in the realm of prejudice. That's what we're talking about when we talk about prejudice. And so the amygdala, the insula are very important in this process. Remember, the insula is really, it processes pain, both like visceral, like feeling pain, but also social pain. So like isolation, exclusion, embarrassment, shame. And then as well as disgust. So like visceral disgust, like you smell something disgusting. And also like social and like moral disgust, same process. And then the amygdala is that fear or like rapid threat association. So sometimes when it's activated, it's not actually always associated with like a subjective sense of discomfort, especially when it's very quick. However, it is associated with like sensing that something is a threat. So it's kind of like you're always taking in information and consolidating it, and the amygdala is always on alert. And as soon as it sees something that is potentially a threat, because of those associations that you've learned throughout life, then it triggers something. So prejudice may reflect a preference towards in-group members or a dislike of out-group members. And this is just, the process of fear conditioning, really. The thing to remember is that this is also automatic, happens super quickly. And the reason that it happens so quickly is because we have all these different neurologic tracks in our brain. And so remember, our visual system, like it has to go through a couple of different synaptic connections until we can process it and think about it and understand what we're seeing. But then there's a shortcut. And so this is what this shows, right? Like there's a shortcut straight to the amygdala. And so sometimes that threat assessment, which is like really important for our survival, right, can happen before we even recognize what's happening, right? And so like think of those videos online where, and we'll talk about how this affects behavior in a minute, but think of the videos online where, someone like, I don't know, catches a baby that's falling off or whatever, and they weren't even really like paying attention. Because this like automatic like threat survival kind of association happens before you even can cognitively be aware of it. And so why is this important? We'll talk about more in a minute, but it's important because like there's nothing to be ashamed about it, and you can't like control it, and you can't like cut this connection. Like that would not be a great thing. So the amygdala activation, whenever we're talking about racial prejudice, in studies, in certain research studies where they were using white research subjects, they would flash images of Black faces. And when those were shown very briefly, like so briefly, they didn't even see an image. Like they could not even cognitively process that they saw an image of a face. On the functional MRI, still the amygdala would light up. And so that amygdala, like the threat doesn't even need to be present for more than 100 milliseconds, and it's already activated, already sending projections throughout the body. when you have no idea what's going on. And the response in these studies in the amygdala was larger in white subjects with high level of prejudice. And so when I say prejudice, I mean implicit bias, because again, all of this is like subconscious, it's automatic, it's nothing that you can control. And a lot of times you're not even aware, right? Because it doesn't match up with explicit beliefs. It doesn't match up with what you value as a person and truly believe in and what your goals and everything are. It's all about what you were conditioned to associate in your brain based on, you know, your position in society and what that means to everyone else. And so people who had a high level of implicit bias, which is this like amygdala emotional association with, you know, outgroups, in this particular case, Black social category, that reflects a learned threat response due to fear conditioning. And again, remember, this happens super early, like this happens during childhood, infancy, whatever. And then the caveat was that the response was also larger in subjects with low implicit bias or low racial prejudice when they were anxious about appearing prejudiced in front of others who disapprove of bias. So we'll talk about more of that when we talk about like aversive racism, but just keep that in the back of your mind right now. Now, is this like embedded, changeable, like we can't do anything about this because we're conditioned when we're babies? And no, actually, it's still just like facial processing, it's still associated with our motivation, right? It's what we're paying attention to. And so you can ask the same white subjects to actually just look for a small dot on the screen, and they do the flashing, faces, and no amygdala response because they're focused on something else. If they are told to identify teammates based on clothing, and the faces were, they could process them and everything, still there was no response to race. So even with that implicit bias, if you were conditioned and you have this high fear conditioning, and a high amount of implicit racial bias, which many people do, you can still, actively try to focus on something else, and you don't have that amygdala response. So we can learn to do this based on our social motivations. So really, what is the point to all of this? That these findings suggest that the amygdala response to racial outgroup members often reflects attention, what we're paying attention to, remember what we're filtering out or in, by social goals and concerns rather than a direct threat of an outgroup member. Okay, think on that for a while. Priming and prejudice. So what kind of things increase our implicit bias or our prejudice? Well, our emotional state definitely plays a role. And this all kind of makes sense, right? Definitely if we're angry, we are going to make these connections stronger, and we are going to strengthen these like implicit bias and this fear conditioning, right? And that kind of, that makes sense just like for survival. But the interesting thing is that when we're feeling neutral or sad, like you don't see the same effect. And so, so what does that mean? It means like maybe if you're angry about something else, like, especially given that like you probably have a certain degree of fear conditioning. If you're angry and you are interacting with outgroup members, recognize that you already can't accurately predict micro expressions, facial expressions. You already probably inaccurately predict neutral expressions, right? And so if you get the sense that, the person you're interacting with is being rude to you, is being aggressive, is being whatever, and you're already angry, realize that that might just be your own bias, because that actually just worsens the whole thing. It might actually be your misperception rather than the behavior or action or facial expression or tone of voice of the person who you are engaging, or interacting with.